Hello and welcome. I'm Jeremy Strick, Director of the Nasher Sculpture Center. We're excited today to begin our annual Nasher Prize Dialogues Graduate Symposium, this year dedicated to the work of the 2020 Nasher Prize Laureate, Michael Rakowitz. While the symposium is usually hosted here in Dallas at the Nasher Sculpture Center, due to the unique circumstances of the pandemic, this year we are hosting it virtually. But the virtual format allows students from around the country and Europe to present their papers, as well as more people to watch and participate in the program than ever before. We're delighted that so many will get to learn more about the compelling work of Michael Rakowitz. I want to express gratitude to the many generous sponsors of this event: Marguerite Hoffman and Thomas Lentz, Elizabeth Redleaf, Alana and Adrian Sada, Albertina Cisneros and Juan Pascual, and Lisa Dawson and Thomas Marstead. Thank you for making it possible for us to further the academic research on this remarkable artist. Today, we'll hear from graduate students Austin Bailey from University of Texas at Dallas and Brandon Sward from the University of Chicago. And steering the conversation over the next 4 days will be Dr. Nada Shabout, an expert on the work of Michael Rakowitz, as well as a close friend of the artist. Nada Shabout is a professor of art history and the coordinator of the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Cultural Studies Initiative at the University of North Texas, Denton, Texas, USA. She is the founding president of the Association for Modern and Contemporary Art from the Arab world, Iran, and Turkey. Shabout was the project advisor for the Saudi National Pavilion Venice Biennale 2019. She is the author of Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetics, co-editor with Salwa Mikdadi of New Vision, Arab Art in the 21st Century, and co-editor of Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents. Shabout has been curator of many exhibitions and the recipient of various awards, including the Presidential Excellency Award, University of North Texas, the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq Fellowship, MIT Visiting Assistant Professor, and Fulbright Senior Scholar Program. Dr. Shabout, thank you so much for your dedication to the 2020 Nasher Prize Graduate Symposium, and thanks to all for watching.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for your presence. It is sad that we are not able to be together in the beautiful Nasher Sculpture Garden building and see Michael's work on exhibition in person. But I'm very happy that we are able to gather for this symposium. I take comfort in that we will nevertheless be engaged in discussing Michael's beautiful work. Thank you to the Nasher team for making this happen and for inviting me to take part of it. 2020 has been like no other year. Certainly the strangest I have lived in every aspect. A year filled with anxiety as humanity is tested by a global pandemic with its fear, restrictions, and isolations. But equally, a year where the digital and virtual world reigned supreme and opened up new global spaces of interaction. It is a year of racial tensions worldwide. Here in the United States, Black Lives Matter tries to fulfill goals invoked by the civil rights movement of the 1960s, reevaluating and rejecting false gains, political correctness, and global conflicts. A year where, despite, or perhaps further fueled by the disparity made more apparent by the pandemic, civil protest that has been gripping public spaces around the world with demands of equity, equality, and freedom continue. Calls to decolonize mind, space, and art history are more encompassing. A year that has witnessed what is classified as one of the largest explosions in history, the Beirut explosion on August 4th. More importantly, it is a year that has clearly demonstrated to us that scholarship as art cannot be disinterested, hiding behind neutrality and objectivity. 2020 also marks the centennial of the 1920 Great Iraqi Revolution. It is the revolt in which Iraqi tribal and religious leaders united against the British authorities who, at the end of World War I, awarded themselves the Mandate of Mesopotamia that started in April 1920. Demonstrations soon turned into a fast-spreading armed revolt around the country in June of that year. The British were brutal in their attempt to crush it and were able to end it in October at a high cost in both casualties and money. The termination of the revolt also resulted in the Hashemite rule over Iraq, installed by the British in 1921. This history is the more remarkable in relation to more recent events, what has been dubbed the October Revolution, the Tishreen Revolution in Arabic, that started last year in Iraq, is an Occupy movement that echoes the 1920 revolution and its desire to reclaim the country. What you see as my virtual background today is Nasb al-Hurriya, Monument of Freedom in Tahrir Square in Baghdad, that has been the site of this revolution. This monument, which is not only the first monument that many of us who grew up in the country had encountered, but also the first in Iraq by an Iraqi artist, Jawad Salim, was commissioned to commemorate the 1958 revolution that was seen to bring hope for better days and for change. Its towering presence is a signification of Iraqi identities. Since last year, the monument provided Iraqi youth with the site to recollect their history, stories, and agency. They reimagined the original monument through outlining it with light. It became a site of ghosting. It is within this context and against this background that Michael's work resonates even louder. I cannot remember when exactly Michael and I met, but I feel that I have known him throughout his career. Might have been Beirut in 2004 or 2005. It was also around that time that he accepted my invitation to the University of North Texas to present his work. He brought me Iraqi dates from his project return. I was conflicted to whether I should eat them or frame them. I decided to eat them. They were delicious. Our friendship has certainly converged over our love and concerns for what has transpired in Iraq. As an art historian, the post-2003 invasion of Iraq with the subsequent looting and destruction of heritage, that sense of loss ushered an urgent call to search for archives, document, and write. It was personal as well as scholarly. I have lived a good and foundational portion of my life in Baghdad. My memories are distant, but real. For Michael, a similar awareness of loss motivated his work. From his early projects, his sense of justice and respect for humanity were evident. The Gulf War and invasion made it all the more personal and urgent. While Michael did not live in Iraq, that part of his family heritage was always there in the memories that were now threatened. He thus understood the urgency to save his grandparents' stories. I see his work since as his search for his past while equally negotiating his present. The Nasher Prize has a record of reevaluating and redefining what sculpture is through the work of its winners. Through his work, Michael Rakowitz forces us to question materiality, monumentality, and urgency. His is activist performance sculpture that creates what he calls situations, encounters and conversations that urge dialogues. Michael makes objects that are replacement signs of what once was. He argues that his work, and I quote, sometimes serves as a kind of a reminder, and sometimes these kind of reminders are inconvenient or unwanted, end of quote. Through keeping memories and conversations going, a restorative act, Michael helps two nations to contend with realities. The act equally keeps his mother's family heritage alive, a heritage that was distant and has then become spectral. Renowned archaeologist and art historian Zainab Bahrani argues that ancient Mesopotamian monuments are understood through the modern context. They thus, and I quote, traverse time. They project their presence into the future while dwelling in the past, end of quote. Michael's act of reappearing, a term I much prefer than remaking or resurrecting, speaks to this traversing. He sees the past as a way of wielding a blueprint for the future, as he says. The lost objects of Iraqi history reappear, engulfed in their contemporary interpretations, hindered within the act of transgression and destruction. Today, we celebrate the work and practice of Michael Rakowitz. Thank you, Michael, for continuing to challenge our understanding of materiality, sculpture, identity, representation, and history, and for your active positions on justice and rights. I look forward to a week of analysis and dialogues around Michael's work and questions leading to a deeper understanding of it. With that, I would like to start our first session, History and the Relation Between East and West, with two papers. Our first speaker is Austin Bailey, and our second speaker is Brandon Sward. I'll start with introducing Austin, who is a graduate student at the University of Texas at Dallas, and is pursuing his master's degree in art history. Austin's paper is titled A Cartesian Theater of Western Imperialism, the Politics and Poetics of Michael Rakowitz. Austin, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen so that we can get the presentation up. And then I'll just confirm with our text that everything is working before we get started. Okay, it looks like we've got the confirmation. Everything is good. So welcome. Thank you everyone for attending this symposium and showing your support. It means a lot to see so many people who are interested in our work. During my first semester at the University of Texas at Dallas, the Nasher had just awarded their annual Laureate Prize to Michael Rakowitz. And once I started learning more about him, I immediately became interested in his work, as it embodies a lot of my scholarly interests. He focuses a lot on history, archaeology, and politics, as well as war and social activism. So needless to say, my interest was piqued. Also, the curators at the Nasher, Jed Morse, Catherine Kraft, and Lee Arnold, all provided me with some fantastic opportunities to get up close and personal with Rakowitz's work. For instance, Dr. Kraft allowed me to oversee the installation of his exhibition at the Nasher and provided me with some great insight that I wouldn't have known otherwise. Now, as far as this presentation is concerned, I'll start with a bit of historical background and contemporary context, but jump quickly into Rakowitz's work. I'll be focusing specifically on the origins of The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist and how it came to fruition. There are other iterations of the project that I won't be able to get into, but I'd love to answer questions about them afterwards, permitting time. Lastly, I'll go into what I've deemed the Cartesian theater of American exceptionalism, which I believe is something that Rakowitz targets heavily with not just The Invisible Enemy, but with many of his other artistic endeavors. So, without further ado, let us begin. From 2003 to 2004, the American and British armed forces occupied Iraq, ultimately laying the groundwork for the country's cultural destruction. While American troops closely safeguarded the oil ministry, they stood idly by as museums, archaeological sites, palaces, mosques, libraries, and monuments were left vulnerable to pillage. 15,000 artifacts were purloined from the National Museum in Baghdad, 12,000 archaeological sites looted, and the National Library was burned to the ground. Even though some artifacts were recovered, there will always be those that remain destroyed, missing, or out in the ether, forever drifting between auctions and private collectors. Granted, there are more positive stories regarding the recovery of objects, such as the artifacts from the National Museum in Baghdad. But the loss of cultural artifacts in Iraq cannot be understated. As Lebanese archaeologist Joanne Farchuk stated in 2007, quote, "Iraq may soon end up with no history," unquote. Alongside Michael Rakowitz, there have been several artists in the contemporary world that have brought attention to the conflict between East and West. Jeremy Deller attempted to give a voice to voiceless Arabic populations when he placed a destroyed car in the middle of London's Imperial War Museum. The vehicle was blown up by a suicide bomber on March 5, 2007, killing 38 people and injuring hundreds more. However, before it was placed in the museum, Deller hitched it on the back of a truck and toured the United States, conducting a conversation between himself, an Iraqi war veteran, and an Iraqi citizen along the way. Not only did it spark many discussions around the US-Iraq conflict, but also about the excesses of war and how Western countries foster such conditions that might result in a suicide bomber blowing up a car. In a similar vein, Morsheen Al-Ayari calls attention to the consequences of Middle Eastern conflicts through her project Material Speculation, where she reconstructs artifacts destroyed by ISIS with 3D printing. Acting as a material archive, each reconstructed artifact holds within it a flash drive and a memory card that contains information about the original object. Al-Ayari's work is simultaneously acting to preserve histories that are often seen as unimportant in the West, while also critiquing relationships between capitalism, waste, plastic in particular, and technology. In his own response to the devastation of Iraqi culture, Michael Rakowitz commenced The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist in 2007. It is an artistic endeavor dedicated to the reimagining of art and artifacts looted from the National Museum in Baghdad. The ongoing project began when Rakowitz visited the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, which houses several civilizational monuments that were taken by Western excavators. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists from countries such as England, France, Germany, and the United States fixated on the Middle East due to its biblical relevance. Cultural norms of the time period dictated that the origins of humanity sprung from the Mesopotamian region. So as a result, European and American scholars traveled there in order to find monuments of ancient biblical civilizations. In fact, the museum gets its name from the Pergamon altar, a 2nd century BC acropolis built in modern-day Turkey that was later excavated by the Germans in the 19th century. To this day, it still resides in the Pergamon Museum. Now, even though Rakowitz was aware that the institution contained many pilfered artifacts, there was one in particular that he didn't expect to see, that is the Ishtar Gate. This Babylonian colossus was originally completed in 575 BC under the reign of the famous King Nebuchadnezzar II. Standing at over 50 feet tall, it was situated along the northern part of a defensive wall and recognized as one of the most important of the 8 entrances into the city. The street that passed through the gate and into the city was known as the Processional Way, where statues of gods were brought to the Enkidu temple during New Year's celebrations. Ajibur Shapu, the Babylonian name of the street where the processions took place, roughly translates to "the invisible enemy should not exist," hence the title of Rakowitz's project. Now, when the Ba'ath Party took power in Iraq, they saw fit to create a scaled-down replica of the Ishtar Gate for a proposed art museum. Although the gate was eventually assembled out of plywood and plaster, the museum was never constructed, leaving the gate abandoned. Fast forward to the Iraq War of 2003, and the Iraqi Ishtar Gate has taken on a new life. In a text attached to his exhibition drawings for May the Arrogant Not Prevail, a spiritual extension of the invisible enemy, Rakowitz details how the Western powers became entangled with the facsimile. American and Polish soldiers used the archaeological site as a military base, covering 4,000 acres with gravel, which contaminated unexcavated areas and damaged the pavement of the processional way with heavy vehicles. The reconstructed gate served as one of the most popular backdrops for US soldiers serving in Iraq. The Iraqi Ishtar Gate was cobbled together out of catchpenny materials and stood as a hollow shell of its predecessor, evoking its presence, but nevertheless a pathetic reimagination. When Rakowitz turned his attention to the National Museum of Baghdad and recognized its connections to the Ishtar Gate, he gave the museum's looted objects a similar treatment to the Iraqi government's replica of the Ishtar Gate. As of today, Rakowitz has rendered over 900 of the 15,000 works that were stolen. Each one receives roughly the same treatment. The artist and his team of assistants consult a database compiled by the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, which has documented almost every single object that was in the National Museum of Iraq. Rakowitz has found photos from which he garnered the true dimensions of given artifacts and then proceeded to construct its ghost with materials such as packaging from Iraqi foodstuffs, local Arabic English newspapers, and date syrup cans. According to Rakowitz himself, quote, "The project is about these fragments of cultural visibility, being enlisted to make these things that are now, for all intents and purposes, invisible," unquote. They are not meant to be replacements for the lost original, but rather a garish and tawdry evocation that emphasizes the absence of its counterpart. Adding to this effect, instead of placing the objects in vitrines or a traditional museum display, Rakowitz lays out the quote-unquote ghosts in the same way that recovered originals were cataloged. When an item was retrieved, it would be brought back to the National Museum in Baghdad, where it was set on a wooden table, documented, and given a number. Rakowitz plays out his ghost similarly, but he also provides an accession card with all of the information that one might find in the Oriental Institute's database. However, instead of pairing the didactic details with a long paragraph that explains the history of the original object, each ghost is supplemented with a quote from an individual reacting to the looting in Baghdad. Some excerpts are from archaeologists and curators that had close personal ties with the stolen artifacts, while others are from US officials who helped foster the very conditions that resulted in the lootings of cultural heritage sites. For example, a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, George W. Bush's Secretary of Defense during the Iraq War, is paired with IM 74827. I'll read the quote now. "And does that mean you couldn't go in there and take a television camera or get a still photographer and take a picture of something that was imperfect, untidy? I could do that in any city in America. Think what's happened in our cities when we've had riots and problems and looting. Stuff happens," unquote. Additionally, IM 19771 features the words of Selma al-Ridi, an archaeologist of Iraqi descent that has pioneered restoration projects in the Mesopotamian region. Her quote is simple and short. "With war comes destruction, the loss of thousands of years of human history," unquote. By incorporating these quotes into the exhibition, Rakowitz is cultivating a dialogue between the protagonists and the antagonists of the US-Iraq conflict. And encircling that conversation, quite literally, is the story of Dr. Donnie George, the man responsible for recovering the works robbed from the National Museum. Illustrations depicting different milestones in his life are hung on the walls that surround the invisible enemy, and are accompanied by an underlying text that details his journey from Baghdad to New York. As president of the Iraq State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, Dr. George would regularly participate in archaeological digs under the reign of Saddam Hussein. Unbeknownst to the dictator, Dr. George was a Syrian Christian, so he regularly used his excavations as an excuse to avoid Ba'ath Party meetings and risk exposing himself. In 2006, Dr. George received an envelope that contained a bullet and a letter threatening to harm him and his family if a ransom was not paid. Out of fear for his life, he fled Iraq with his family, went to Syria, and then found asylum in the United States as a visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Yet, Dr. George was more than just a man who protected Iraqi cultural heritage. He was the drummer for a band called 99%, short for 99% of Excellence, which specialized in Deep Purple covers. As a sonic homage to Dr. George, Rakowitz commissioned an Arabic band in Brooklyn to record a cover of Smoke on the Water. When one walked through the Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, Recovered Missing Stolen series exhibit, the audio of the famous Deep Purple song plays as the accompanied backtrack, conjuring the specter of Dr. George's humanity. In its most recent iteration, the Invisible Enemy has taken the form of the Northwest Palace of Nimrud, another archaeological wonder eradicated by ISIS. Syrian monarch Ashurnasirpal II was responsible for the building's initial conception in the 9th century BC and constructed it as an homage to the monarch's military conquests. It sat squarely in the middle of a walled citadel, taking up roughly 253,000 square feet of space, atop a mound that overlooked the Tigris River. The palace was a monolith of modern art and technology for the time. Its state apartments composed of gargantuan stone slabs and colorful reliefs that adorn the walls. Like many great buildings in the Mesopotamian region, it unfortunately fell into dilapidation until it was uncovered in the 19th century by a Western archaeologist. Foreign excavations continued for decades, as walls and artistic remnants were taken back to American and European museums. Today, artifacts from the Northwest Palace can be found in over 75 institutions across the world. Responding to these histories of colonialism and its relation to the museum, Rakowitz used his ghosting techniques to reimagine specific rooms in situ from the Palace of Nimrud. Now on a much bigger scale than the first iteration, Rakowitz and his team of artists employed colorful food packaging and Arabic newspapers to reconceptualize the magnificent wall reliefs. Each room is made up of several panels spaced out according to the dimensions of the original area within the palace. For room F, which is currently being shown at the Nasher, Rakowitz constructed 5 freestanding reliefs that feature staples of Assyrian iconography, most of which are detailed with vibrant blues, greens, yellows, and pinks. 2 panels depict the demigod Apkallu, a human-bird hybrid that embodied wisdom according to Assyrian mythology, while 2 others display date palms and white flowers. The 5th, and perhaps most critical panel, is covered in solid browns and grays, alluding to the scars of the panels that were taken from their homes. Additionally, similar to all of the other Invisible Enemy iterations, each project is site-specific. Take Room Z, for example. From September 2019 to April 2020, Room Z was on display at the Williams College Museum of Art, the very same institution that houses 2 original stone reliefs from the Palace of Nimrud. The artist's true-to-scale reproduction of Room Z occupied one room, while a narrow hall leads down to the Stoddard Gallery, an area that displays the WCMA's originals. The ghost of Room Z sits in dialogue with the displaced autochthon, bringing the past into the present. Adding another layer to the Invisible Enemy, Rakowitz utilizes the Northwest Palace to illuminate objects in their spatial and temporal variants. It is rare that any object remains within the constraints of its original conceptualization. Much like ourselves, they glide through borders and transcend paradigms, taking on new lives and meanings along the way. The museum is no different, and through its centuries of appropriation and subjugation of artifacts, it has come to represent a mausoleum of countless cultures across the world. In the Williams College Museum of Art, Rakowitz is manifesting the ghosts of these marauded pasts, making curators and visitors alike wrestle with the histories that are often difficult to resolve. Within the entirety of his exhibitions, I argue that Rakowitz is ultimately staging a theater, turning his bric-a-brac ghosts into props and the museum into a stage. The audience, which Rakowitz caters the exhibition to, is targeted specifically at Westerners and attempts to challenge the Cartesian theater of American and, to some extent, British exceptionalism. After the Cold War, there is a particular version of exceptionalism that emerges from the Western powers, purge the world of terrorism, and spread the values of democracy far and wide. Scholars David Forsyth and Patrice McMahon argue that this mission to spread freedom around the world is fraught with rhetorical devices and propaganda. Instead of being a beacon of democracy for the world to look to, America, and to a large extent Britain, peddled an inconsistent promise that became an intentional strategy, not only to promote quote-unquote freedom, but to advance national interests and secure American primacy. A kind of separation emerges in the consciousness of the American public during this time period, one that is not dissimilar to a Cartesian dualism. Just as René Descartes posited that the body is separable from the mind, Americans often disassociate modern-day atrocities in the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere from their own country's culpability. However, this is merely an illusion, one that philosopher Daniel Dennett calls a Cartesian theater. As a leftover of base materialism, Cartesian theater operates by utilizing a tactic of self-protection, self-control, and self-definition in order to tell stories that connect and control one's identity in their own minds as well as everyone else's. Now, this is precisely what Westerners do in the 21st century when, for example, they see the devastation that has taken place in Iraq. It could not possibly be that a quote-unquote exceptional country, such as the United States or Great Britain, instituted policies that led to the mass suffering of civilians and the destruction of cultural artifacts. So instead, they blame the other, or the quote-unquote uncivilized, barbaric Arab that is antithetical to their own ideas. So Rakowitz attempts to deconstruct that illusion by placing the ghosts of Arab cultural artifacts in front of the viewer. As the artist entices them through the vibrant and playful reimagining of artifacts, a closer examination begins to reveal deeper truths about Western imperialism. In this reflexive tactic, Rakowitz mirrors this dualism of American exceptionalism, demonstrating that looks are often deceptive and never quite tell the whole story. Yet, challenging American politics is not Rakowitz's entire endgame. His ghosts are housed in specific places for specific reasons, as he accosts the very notion of high art in the museums that are built to house it. Cultural institutions in the West have often treated quote-unquote Oriental artifacts as lesser, viewing them as primitive and categorically separate from the art historical canon. These attitudes have ultimately led to the mishandling of artistic objects from outside the West, and many are currently wasting away in the storage houses of prominent museums. What's worse, Western powers have frequently ignored the protection of cultural institutions during times of conflict. The looting and ruination of the National Museum in Baghdad is a primary example of this phenomena. So, Rakowitz uses it as the lifeblood of his very first Invisible Enemy project to fuel his polemic against the excesses of war. In turn, Rakowitz creates his vast web in order to collapse binaries and merge disparate collectives. The apparitions of trash, politics, Arabs, and artifacts are brought under the same roof in the Invisible Enemy, all of them haunting others, with the goal of creating relational ties that bind humanity together. So Rakowitz sets his stage and plants Easter eggs along the way. Like a trail of breadcrumbs, he leads the viewer into his own world of paradigms that both converge at some points and diverge at others. But he doesn't do this in a patronizing or condescending manner. Rather than using the enigmatic and confounding tactics that are so often seen in the works of modern art, Rakowitz makes his projects approachable for the layman, allowing them to freely participate in his constructed discourses. This is the theater of Michael Rakowitz, using cultural ghosts as his props and placing them on different stages. The viewer or participator doubles as both actor and audience, but the artist attempts to dispel the notion that they're different things. Instead, Rakowitz's theater views them as one and the same, mirroring the Cartesian theater of American exceptionalism. With false dualisms eliminated, Rakowitz can perhaps illuminate the terrors of Western imperialism, or perhaps start a museum down the road to repatriation. That way, the invisible enemy and the invisible victims might not be so invisible anymore. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin, very much for a very thought-provoking paper. Our next presenter is Brandon Sward, who is an artist, performer, writer, organizer, and doctoral candidate at the University of Chicago. He will present his paper, The Politics of Translation. Brandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just gonna run through this quickly to make sure stuff is displaying correctly. Thank you all for being here in your various capacities. We've gotten theater as a metaphor already, which is appropriate because both theater and things like this take a village to make them happen. So The Politics of Translation. For Rocco. I think my friend has PTSD. He told me about hearing a loud bang near where he works downtown that prompted him to start running, unsure where, unsure why. He tried to catch his breath through gusts of wind and eventually took shelter in an alcove. Gradually, I begin to connect these responses to his childhood, revealed to me in slivers. Partly these stories are idyllic tales of preteens wandering the streets of Southeastern Europe, memories of his favorite teachers, his mother. But sometimes I learn terrible things, like the biology instructor holdover from the communist period who required total silence in her classroom and graded her students solely on the basis of grueling oral exams she expected to be flawlessly delivered. I hear about children killed by shrapnel. Despite growing up amidst the carnage of the Yugoslav wars, my friend's eyes were also turned westward. When his mother asked him what he wanted from the US before she went, he requested anything about Aaliyah and received upon her return a book about the R&B singer. He tells me about spending time in online chat rooms as a queer child. To this day, he has a dog tag necklace sent to him by an older gay man in the US on which the visage of Madonna hovers in ghostly outline. I meet up with this friend in the small park in front of Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art before going inside. We're attending a dinner hosted by Michael Rakowitz, an artist whose Backstroke of the West is currently on view. This dinner, Enemy Kitchen, is also a work of art. Rakowitz himself and veterans of the Iraq War serve us Iraqi dishes. An Iraqi-American Jewish artist whose family fled Iraq, Rakowitz is uniquely sensitive to what happens when culture crosses national borders. Backstroke of the West references a mistranslation of Revenge of the Sith for a Chinese bootleg version of the film. Although China isn't especially present in the exhibition, there are plenty of surprising connections drawn between the Star Wars franchise and Iraq, such as vitrines that display Darth Vader helmets alongside gas masks and Fayadeen uniforms, the official costume of the paramilitary organization of Saddam Hussein's government. I learned from a comic book accompanying the show entitled Strike the Empire Back that Uday, Hussein's eldest son, presented his father with a prototypical helmet for the uniform, an exact replica of Darth Vader's. But this isn't the only Star Wars reference. Consider the worst condition is to pass under a sword which is not one's own. The sentence comes from an invitation sent by Hussein for the inauguration of the Victory Arch, a pair of triumphal arches in Baghdad. The arches frame the entrances to the Great Celebrations Square, the main square for public celebrations in Baghdad. Giant bronze casts of Hussein's hands wield the swords of Qadisiyah, the legendary blades of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, who led the conquest of Persia in 636 CE. The blades were forged from the molten steel of the weapons of slain Iraqis, rising above the helmets of the vanquished Iranians. The form of the monument replicates that of another Darth Vader, who crosses two lightsabers in his hands on a promotional poster for The Empire Strikes Back. Backstroke of the West is fundamentally about translation, though not as we usually mean the term. Translation is primarily understood as a linguistic activity, whereby one language is converted into another. As such, translation is intimately caught up with meaning. We judge how good a translation is by how well it recreates the meaning expressed in one language in another. Accordingly, we almost immediately run into a problem. Is the best translation the one that reproduces the initial meaning most literally, or the one that captures the more diffuse spirit of the initial meaning? Within the subtleties of language, we can easily imagine these two imperatives coming into conflict. In The Task of the Translator, the introduction to his translation of Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien, Walter Benjamin asks us to expand our concept of translation. Translation is so far removed from being the sterile equation of two dead languages that of all literary forms, it is the one charged with the special mission of watching over the maturing process of the original language and the birth pangs of its own. If translation is indeed not about attempting to fit one language into another, certain issues fall away, such as the potential tension between the literal and the figurative. But then it becomes entirely unclear what translation aims for. What does it mean for translation to watch over the maturing process of the original language and the birth pangs of its own? Benjamin responds, the task of the translator consists in finding that intended effect upon the language into which he is translating, which reproduces in it the echo of the original. This answer shifts our attention to a higher level. Rather than merely translating text in one language into another, for Benjamin, every act of translation must take into account the entirety of the two languages. Of course, much of a language lies dormant when we translate. Nevertheless, we must always have a language as a whole in mind during translation because the text is never just a text. A text is always written within a language, and in this way does not consist merely of what is on the page. The entirety of a language is present in every utterance, if only negatively. The translator's chosen words are fished out of a sea of possibility, and the choice of a word is always the passing over of others. Meaning resides not just within a text, but just as consequentially outside of it. Rakowitz's translations, however, have a playful character at odds with the solemnity of the Benjaminian translator, such as in May the Arrogant Not Prevail, a replica of the Ishtar Gate, the famous 8th gate of Babylon, constructed by order of King Nebuchadnezzar II, circa 575 BCE. The sculpture was created by a team of assistants out of Arabic food packaging and installed at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. A 1930 reconstruction using the original bricks is now shown at the Pergamon Museum, also in Berlin. While May the Arrogant Not Prevail is a translation of the Ishtar Gates, are themselves also a translation. Had the Ishtar Gates been reconstructed in the Middle East, they may well have become a symbol of the ancient civilization to which the region is heir, analogous to the Acropolis of Athens or the Colosseum of Rome. But the presence of the gates in Berlin produces a very different effect. Rather than connecting the West to its pasts, the gates instead perform Arabness for a largely Western audience. As a translation of a translation, May the Arrogant Not Prevail potentially has a greater degree of significatory freedom. Rather than faithfully reconstructing a historical past, May the Arrogant Not Prevail calls our attention to the inherent artificiality of history. Just as for Benjamin, the choice of one word requires the non-choice of others, so too does the choice of one narrative require the non-choice of others. For the past several millennia, these narratives have centered a world known as Western, initially limited to Europe, but eventually encompassing the settler colonies of Oceania and North America. This Western world was and is predominantly white and Christian, while the non-West was everything else, the West and the rest. Due to centuries of colonial and imperial expansion, the West has been able to tell history in its own terms, not only due to an extreme power imbalance, but also due to its possession of much of the world's cultural wealth. As a play requires props, so history requires artifacts. But the transfer of antiquities to Western museums has prevented the non-Western societies from telling their own histories. For Rakowitz, this cultural transfer is exemplified by the looting of the National Museum of Iraq during and after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Many of the items stolen during this period still haven't been located. In an ongoing project entitled The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, Rakowitz attempts to reconstruct the over 7,000 objects missing from the National Museum. On some level, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist is an exercise in Sisyphean absurdism. How much time and effort would it actually take to reproduce all of these, even with the help of a team of assistants? Can we be sure there aren't others? Even if the collection were exhaustive, these recreations aren't the real deal, a fact Rakowitz draws attention to through the makeshift character of these reconstructions. Perhaps the failure of this work to reapproximate reality is part of its power, calling our attention to a break in the chain of history that cannot be repaired completely. Just as how The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist is only a shadow of what was once a robust collection. Unfortunately, this isn't the first cultural casualty of war. Another other of the US was Germany during World War II, which also suffered a great deal of cultural destruction. For example, a fire in the Fredericania Museum in Kassel incinerated state library books during a bombing by the British Air Force on September 9th, 1941. For What Dust Will Rise, Rakowitz enlisted Afghan and Italian carvers to reproduce stone replicas of these volumes out of travertine from the Bamiyan Valley, where the Taliban dynamited 2 monumental Buddhas dating from the 6th century. In What Dust Will Rise, Rakowitz has brought together 3 enemies of the US, Afghanistan as a result of 9/11, and Germany and Italy of World War II, in order to recover some of what was lost on September 9th, 1941. By presenting the work at Documenta, the famous art fair held every 5 years in Kassel, Rakowitz dredges up another forgetting that many in the art world would prefer to remain forgotten. The first Documenta in 1955 was an attempt to showcase Germany as an enlightened country after the madness of National Socialism, and several of the artists of its initial iteration were indeed retrospectively seen as modernist torchbearers: Vasily Kandinsky, Pierre Mondrian, Pablo Picasso. The same city, pummeled for its regression, becomes a few short years later the beacon of progression. What role does art play in the shifting of political alliances under the pressure of war? Apparently, state actors thought art was powerful enough to change the image of Germany abroad that they organized and funded an enormous exhibition continuing to the present day. As a whole, Backstroke of the West demonstrates how history is not just what is remembered, but also what is forgotten, and is composed not just of what is present, but also what is absent. In this way, there's much resonance between Rakowitz and Benjamin, who similarly understands translation as attending to both what is and is not on the page. It's as if language is a room and a text is a voice reverberating through it. The bigger the room, the more powerful the voice, the smaller, the weaker. This is why Benjamin rejects translation as a sterile equation of 2 dead languages. Instead, translation produces in it the echo of the original. Each translation stands in relation to the totality of a language, just as each narrative stands in relation to the totality of history. A selection of words, whether in a translation or in a story, is the non-selection of others. While this statement borders on truism, Backstroke of the West illustrates how memory and relics are differentially distributed across the globe, with the lion's share going to those countries able to dominate socially, politically, or economically. I'm often told history is written by the victors, but I'd never wondered why this should be true until seeing Backstroke of the West. Stripped of materiality, culture lives only in the mind, where it will eventually waste away. But what of my friend, driven to run through the streets of Chicago by some unseen force? Translation isn't just cerebral. It isn't limited to the abstractions of language and history. Translation is felt through the body as it passes from one place to another, from one moment to the next. Our bodies record where we've been and carry these impressions with us. Art can bring us back into touch with this materiality. In our digital age, we may be tempted to believe that the corporeal is receding in importance, that technology is liberating us from our fleshy sacks. But nothing could be further from the truth. We continue to live intimately with the material, from the clothes on our backs to the roofs over our heads. Art is differentiated from all other materials because it's where the physical and the metaphysical touch. Since art can be anything, what it ends up being tells us a lot about ourselves, providing a vehicle for our anxieties, our hopes, and our dreams. As such, we've been making art, or at least non-functional objects, longer than we've been writing. Early examples include elaborate jewelry buried with the dead, even amid relative scarcity. Art is existential scream against the void, luggage for an unknown voyage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon, for yet another very thought-provoking paper. I think there's much sort of in dialogue between both Austin and Brandon's papers. So we have few minutes for questions. And as I wait to get questions from the chat and from our audience, I have a question, or rather, sort of like an opening for a further discussion as opposed to a question. I can't help but, as I hear certain words in both in the two papers, whether we're talking translation, an issue that I've dealt with as an historian in the literal sense of translating languages in a very complicated way, representations, construction, discoveries, cultural transfer, but all within sort of your discussion of also issues of colonialism, Orientalism, archaeological discoveries with museums. All of these that are issues that sort of, speak of representing an other, but, from a specific perspective or a lacking perspective. Austin even mentioned the project with Jeremy Deller. So a very complicated question or issue that I'm trying to put on the table, maybe not so clearly because of all these, various ideas that are going through my head. But I'd like to hear from both of you about how do you see Michael's work specifically different than, than, let's say, archaeological excavations, because in certain ways, we can think of Michael's work as excavations as well. How is it, though, different than the notion of discovery, which was sort of, the Orientalist plague of what archaeology has done in the, let's say, the Middle East, as we speak of Mesopotamia or Iraq, and how then it ended up in these sort of storages that are the Western museums, and as you pointed out, many of which just stay in absent as opposed to present. So how do we then think, or I'd like to hear more about how do you think Michael represents this other, whether it's in the history or the victim of the contemporary, in ways that are different than historical. How do we sort of, where do we see the line between representing the victim, the voice of the other, and exploitation, for example? And we can start with Austin and then Brandon, just to keep the structure.
Sure. That's a great question. And I was just speaking with Dr. Jason Hill at the University of Delaware, who talks a lot about media and politics and how Middle Eastern countries are portrayed in the American media and things of that nature. But one thing that he said to me was that the most difficult thing for us as scholars is how to represent suffering, and how do we write about suffering, and then in turn, how do artists react to suffering? And so I think with your question, in how is Michael different in a sense than these than archaeological histories or something of that nature, is, as I said in my presentation, he makes it very approachable, and he does this in a way, I would say, with his culinary projects in particular, with Enemy Kitchen and Return, forming these communities and fostering conversations that aren't normally had. And then with The Invisible Enemy, sort of using detritus and trash, but not in a way that was done earlier by modernists. And he presents it in a way that is colorful and inviting and easy to approach. And I think in that manner, he makes talking about these issues a little bit easier to do between academics and between visitors, museum visitors alike.
Yeah, so I would agree with a lot of that and crank up the volumes. So I think that there is like a critique of certain kinds of expertise, expert knowledge, and authority that's happening in Michael's work. So it's like we talk about things like history and archaeology, and regardless of how much post-structuralist theory we all read, I feel like there's a very real sense within the academy that we're doing something like achieving truth in some way. So in terms of like dating artifacts, it's like, was it used for this or that? Is it from this culture or that culture? And I think that, so it's like by, in the museum labels especially, it's like you're seeing, the museum label conventionally is kind of, it's like this voice of authority, like from nowhere, like the voice of the museum. It's like, who knows who wrote that, and it kind of like gives it more authority because it doesn't have like, we don't know who wrote it. And I think that by like playing with those sorts of things, and this is how I think that it's, sorry, you're on this side for me. I think that this is how like the inviting thing, how it kind of cranks that up, because I feel there's, it makes me sad because I feel like a lot of people think that they need some kind of like special knowledge or something to think about art, have an opinion about art. And I feel like this like communal aspect of a lot of the work that you're describing, it's like, I take it both as like an invitation for viewers and also like a critique of, it's not these, it's like these institutions or these individuals holding all of this interpretive power or intellectual weight or whatever is very similar to, all of that weight being concentrated in the Western world through artifacts. And that's like, I think that's like that's like the same dynamic that he's critiquing or putting pressure on in both instances.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elaborating on your ideas. And I asked this question because I heard it coming through your papers, and particularly the personal, connection that, Brandon, with that recitation of a very beautiful, very heart-wrenching in various ways, entry was made it even more palpable. So I would, we will have, this is a great sort of beginning for the week of our discussions and our talks about the work of Michael Rakowitz. We will have on Friday a roundtable discussion where I will have way more questions for you. But for the sake of keeping to time, which is, not something easily done, I think unless there are any questions coming through the chat, I think we are, which we do. So we'll have one question, unfortunately, because then, it's we're not having, much time left with this. So the question is coming through. I am curious about how Rakowitz's work has evolved into our present protectionist moment under the Trump administration. The work Rakowitz made was in part a response to neoconservatives going to war for the sake of the spread of democracy. Of course, we all know that Iraqi wars were driven by dollars and oil, but this mythology of Americans spreading democracy through neoconservative ideals has disappeared. Does this reframe the work?
That's a very difficult question to answer because, we know, like you said, from neoconservative ideology that, Condoleezza Rice wrote in her book that was all propaganda. It was, she even admitted that we were going to Iraq to dethrone Saddam Hussein. She just came out point blank and said it. And in the Trump era, it's, there were tensions starting to stir between Iran and the United States due to the assassination of one of their military leaders. And then had COVID not happened, who knows where that might have taken us. So the Trump era of conservatism, I think, is very new and is still being evaluated and contextualized. Whereas with Rakowitz's work, he's really reflecting on a lot of issues that came in the early 2000s with the destruction of artifacts, and now we're sort of we're in the aftermath now. In some senses, we're like, I don't want to say that, it's over by any stretch of the imagination, but we're in a period of hindsight, so to speak. So who knows what Michael might come up with in the next decade or so, responding to other issues that we're facing right now.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I feel like there's something very prescient in looking at his past work now, that all of these things that the US was supposedly spreading, like democracy and like respect for rights and like the peaceful transition of power, are all things that we're seeing are not as strong in the US as we perhaps thought. So this emperor, the emperor has no clothes type moment. And I think that this is, again, like very much like what Rakowitz is getting at, that a lot of these authorities are, they're powerful and they're real and they have real effects, but they're ultimately built on sand, and that, it's always liable to change. So.
Well, thank you very much for answering the question in chat. Unfortunately, we are, while we were told we could be a couple of minutes over time, we are now. And so, with that, I would like to close today's session. And as I said, we will have time on Friday to discuss this even further. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Thank you both very much, Austin and Brandon, for your participation in this and for your excellent sort of, beginning of our symposium.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I hope to see you, some of you, well, not see you, but I hope to feel your presence on Friday.
Okay. Bye-bye. On Friday, it will be live. Bye-bye.